So I'll get us started for this exciting hour of discussion. So just to say, a big welcome to everyone this afternoon who's joining us for this really important discussion on tackling the crisis of ethnic minority youth unemployment. My name is Matt Johnson, and I am a research associate that's based at the Runnymede Trust, and I'll be chairing the discussions, the webinar today. And it is of course always a pleasure to have these conversations with everyone. And before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge the Center on Dynamics of Ethnicity, otherwise known as CODE, that's based at the University of Manchester. And at the Runnymede Trust, we work very closely with CODE to host these various discussions on these important issues. Now, these webinars they're really designed to be a productive conversation where we not only discuss problems and issues, but we also try to imagine and reimagine a new reality and a better future. And the topic for today's conversation is truly apt for that because, of course, young people are not just the future, but they're also the makers, shapers, and innovators of today. And today I'm really excited to say that we're joined by 3 expert panelists who also each bring their unique angle and perspectives. So firstly, we're joined by Dr. Steve Nolan, who will provide us with an important academic perspective. Steve is a lecturer in economics in Liverpool John Moores University, and also an associate member of CODE, which I discussed before. And his research interests include labor market outcomes for people from ethnic minority backgrounds. We also have Mutlib, who's the chair of the BAME Apprenticeship Alliance. And the BAME Apprenticeship Alliance aims to promote apprenticeship diversity, which is incredibly important through educations, organizations on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, engaging with BAME communities and helping to recruit from them as well. And Issa is the CEO of the BAME Apprenticeship Alliance, who actively promote apprenticeship diversity and increasing access to high quality opportunity for underrepresented talent. And also today we acknowledge that it's the start of National Apprenticeship Week. So I'm sure that this is very busy today. It will be a very busy week. So a special thank you for joining us today for this hour of discussions. Last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Andrea Barry, who is Analysis Manager at the Youth Futures Foundation. And Youth Futures is a not-for-profit organization that was established in 2019 to really improve outcomes for young people from marginalized backgrounds. And the core of the Youth Futures Foundation work involves looking at the youth unemployment crisis. And before this, Andrea was senior analyst at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and she also has a PhD in economics based at the University of York. So, Andrea, if we kick off the discussions with your perspective on this issue, because of course, finding work as a young person can be a challenge for someone of any race. But when we look at the data, it seems that as a whole, there are concerning disparities that also have racial and ethnic dynamics. For example, young Black Londoners are twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. And when we look at the youth unemployment rate as a whole among ethnic groups, where it's estimated to be in a region of about 20%, which is much larger than sort of the 12% faced by white youths. What are some of the reasons for this, and how do you think this can be addressed?
Thank you for inviting me as well. I just think it's really important to set out initially that this gap in employment and unemployment has been persistent. So this isn't new. This isn't, pandemic effects. This gap has been here a very, very long time. And it's just exacerbated these old issues. So during the pandemic, the largest increases in youth unemployment came from young ethnic minorities, especially young Black people. It's largely due to the sectors they work in. And it's incredibly stark because pre-pandemic, fewer than half of Black and Asian young people were in work compared to 2/3 of young white people. Part of this is due to participation in education, which I can go to again in a minute. But during the pandemic, Black and Asian young people accounted for 2/3 of the total fall in youth employment, despite only being 1 in 8 of all young people in work. So the impacts were great. And so part of the current gaps is due to some of the pandemic effects. But like I said, it was before.
Yeah.
And so research suggests it's due to sectoral and occupational segregation in the labor market. So people from ethnic minority groups will benefit less from employment growth. And this work comes from our work with the Institute for Employment Studies and IPPR. A report came out in October of 2021. And it was just looking at the scale of employment differences between ethnic groups and young people as a whole. There are other research that highlighted the role of insecure work as well. And that's another aspect of this that we should really understand is young people are, as a whole, more likely to be in insecure work, but young Black and Asian people are substantially more likely to be in insecure work. There's a sectoral or occupational polarization in the labor market as well. And these are significant structural reasons why they will be more likely to be unemployed versus their white counterparts. But even in education, when they're in education, they're more likely to be unemployed or inactive. And that's a significant problem. Young people tell us it's really hard to find a job sometimes because they're not just looking for any job, they're looking for a good job. Yeah. They're looking for a job that they can progress in. So not just low skill or high skill. They need these medium skill jobs that they can progress through for better pay, better options. So I think when, thinking about this as a whole, holistic view of the problem, it's not just employment or unemployment, it's NEET levels, it's inactivity levels, and it's just so much more going on that we should really be looking at. So in order to address it, you need a wider view. It's leveling up, it's locations as well. Where are they working? Where are they finding jobs? It's skills, it's just so much more. I think I'll stop there because I would be really interested to hear what my other colleagues have to say about it as well. But I can go on forever if you want.
Yeah, that's a very insightful and interesting perspective. I mean, Steve, you've been looking at this issue extensively for your research work. And if I could ask you, picking up on Andrea's points, what do you see as, in addition to some of the reasons for some of these disparities, and how do you think these can be addressed?
Right. Well, I mean, I definitely kind of undermine all Andrea's points there, especially kind of around education. There's quite obviously kind of young people moving from kind of education into employment. There's a lot going on there. And also there's kind of different movements where you're going from secondary into higher education, further education, or straight into the jobs market, or training, as we'll speak about in a bit. I'm kind of like focusing on higher education. There's a lot to kind of look at there because the headline figures quite good in terms of ethnic minority young people engagement. The enrollments are much, much higher compared to kind of their white counterparts. But obviously kind of enrollments is one thing, achievements is something else. So University UK looked into this kind of attainment gap with a good report called Bridging the Gap back in 2019. And again, we talked about these problems being persistent. We see a persistent attainment gap as well between white students and ethnic minority students. White students about 13 percentage points more likely to get a first or a 2-1 in that. And we can go kind of went even deeper in the data, which is always good to see, because one of the big problems, I mean, and I will be doing it today myself, is sometimes I'll be talking about ethnic minority students as a homogenous group, which is obviously not true. So, but like breaking it down to kind of Black students and controlling for prior attainment, still seeing a kind of big 17% attainment gap and 10% for Chinese students. So there's something happening within the university system that needs to be addressed. It was actually an interesting report by Unite students this week about how they experience kind of halls, like their experience in halls, and how that can have an impact on their kind of attainment values, their education values. It just kind of to highlight that the whole experience needs to be considered in that respect. And this is obviously going to have an impact on the labour market. It's not necessarily always the thing. They think there is actually positive kind of data in terms of, especially for Indian and Chinese graduates, actually earning more than white graduates at the median persistently over 10 years. But for other ethnic groups, we're not seeing that as much as a kind of tendency to pay gap to widen over time. Now, part of this can be down to, again, looking kind of in more granular level, what institutions are these students attending? So for Black students in particular, they're much, much more likely to be attending what we call kind of low tariff institutions, much more so than their white counterparts, who are more likely to be found in red brick, Russell Group institutions. Now, so that's going to have some impact on the labour market. These kind of low tariff institutions could be thought to have less value degrees. Now, I don't want to kind of advocate a kind of utilitarian kind of viewpoint of education. I'm a lecturer at one of these institutions, and I think what we offer is good value. But there is, you know, the debate around education is quite framed in this market. So we can have these headline positive stories and positive statistics, but underneath it, we have different things going about it. So one of the kind of suggestions of how can we encourage students to feel more comfortable to apply for and reach the kind of what we view as the better institutions is to have better representation at those institutions. Now, I like saying that is kind of not a very simple thing. It's almost a chicken and egg thing. You can't have one without the other. But it's definitely something that I know kind of like institutions, to be fair to them, are thinking this, are attempting to do this, but it needs to be done all the time.
Israel, I'll come to you shortly, but I'm interested in your perspective on the higher education level, where you've talked about the gap between enrollments and outcomes. Just quickly, in terms of the data on that, in terms of how this can be addressed, how would you say that there are significant gaps in the how, in terms of looking at the experience of say ethnic minorities within sort of ethnic minority students within higher education, and the outcomes that aren't, and some of the less welcome outcomes essentially. Do we have that quality data with us right now?
Well, ostensibly, I would imagine we do have data. I mean, like the HESA data will be kind of a granular level, that kind of thing. And I think we're going to begin to see a lot better kind of research in this area because of a new data set called Longitudinal Educational Outcomes, which is essentially following, I think it's a cohort from about 2006. It's linking up kind of pupil level data, higher education institution data, and then kind of tax data and business engagement data. So we're going to be able to tell a better story of kind of following like the life story of these kind of large sample sizes. So we hopefully will be able to kind of disaggregate a lot of the kind of headline effects I'm talking about in the future. At the moment, there's probably more kind of descriptive stuff, but like I think coming down the line, we're going to see a lot better research. And I think there's a real kind of appetite for it from kind of the ONS to get researchers working on this.
Yeah. I want to come back to, I've noted the question around data infrastructure, because I know that is also an area that Andrea is involved in as well. And I know that's a keen interest of yours. But I just want to bring in Isan. I will return to you, Andrea, because I know that's one of your areas. But Isan, from your perspective, what are some of the reasons, you know, again, that we've discussed a lot of them already, but is there anything else? What are some of the reasons that you see for some of these disparities, and how do you think that this can be addressed? Ooh, I think you're muted.
If you were to look at the communities that we sort of serve, which are predominantly in inner city, so inner city areas like Birmingham, Manchester, London, there are fundamental progression issues with regards to talent within these communities. So it could be socioeconomic issues like money, it could be basic living standards and family upbringing, etc., role models. There are a multitude of reasons why you kind of pinpoint on for different people where they feel as though their progression could lack. For example, role models. They can't see anybody, they've never seen anybody in their a role which they can aspire to be. And if you don't have that aspiration within an early stage from early careers, then it's very rare to, and you won't find aspirations be met as a result of no a person to aspire to be like or to be from. So funnily enough, if you look at communities where there are strong disparities, particularly like you gave the example of the Indian community, but then if you look at some of the Pakistani communities, where if you're to have an intersection of their the data there, you'll see that women and predominantly women within the Pakistani cultures are not necessarily. Now this is changing, but the data for the last sort of 5 to 10 years has shown that women are less likely to go into work versus men. Whereas, and there are many reasons for that, but this is just kind of reading out what the data says in some of these areas. Now, I think a lot of also some of the disparities kind of come from educational attainment when it comes to basic level schools and the support that schools give to individuals from Black, Asian, or ethnic communities to be able to allow them to attain basic skills within schools. But is this a schooling issue? Is this an issue that stems back at home, or is this a challenge that it faces for young people in particular, whether it be neurodiversity, etc.? Then these are the challenges that institutions need to actively work on trying to find why. But take it as an individualized approach. Don't take it as a holistic approach, because every person has different needs. Every person has different ways of learning, different ways of attaining knowledge and acquiring knowledge, and also different ways of working. And it's about assessing that process for that individual to be able to attain a career in something that they like to do.
Definitely, that's crucially important. And I think what you said there about giving that opportunity is critical. I just want to return just briefly to this question around the data infrastructure. I know, Andrea, you had your hand up there briefly, but particularly when it comes to qualitative data, people's experiences, people's stories, people's narratives. I mean, what would you say about the quality of data that we have about the how and about how this can be addressed?
Thanks. I was just going to bring attention as well to the EVEN survey, which is codes, which is done by code. I remember last year during the pandemic, they really brought out this amazing survey, which is the Evidence-Free Quality National Survey, and it was one of the first surveys to really go to ethnic minorities and really look at their experiences during a crisis, which is alarming that there's very little surveys that actually really ask certain questions to ethnic minorities that are not necessarily relevant to the rest of the population or even white population. So things on discrimination, for example, in the workplace, I think is a really important aspect that we really don't know. And that's where qualitative studies can help and qualitative work. So Youth Futures Foundation has the youth voice aspect to a lot of our work, where we go to young people and ask their opinion and their experiences and really try to integrate that in our quantitative work. At Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we did that with our participation work as well. So that aspect is really important, because the national surveys will not ask these questions. It can be described as, in a way, as institutional racism, because they don't necessarily ask the questions that are relevant to certain groups to really understand their life and how they experience life in this country and around the world. But that's where I think sometimes the data infrastructure can lag behind. It is a substantial opportunity to understand how we can improve data access and data opportunities to understand these groups, because there's a lot that we don't know as a sector. And I say this as someone in the sector in doing this work. And just a mini plug at the youth employment group, YFF are part of the youth employment group. And we have the subgroup on young ethnic minorities as a whole. And part of that is a piece of research that I'm leading on, which is data gap map. So we're trying to understand how does this actually affect outcomes? How does this affect our understanding of outcomes? And it's still going to be relatively limited because of the data itself. So it's again showing just how much you can and cannot do. And I think this is something the ONS, the government, as well as academic institutions and the sector itself should and could get a part of. I am, there's loads of evidence on the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in surveys as a whole, especially young ethnic minorities in these surveys. So you don't always have a complete picture of their lives, but even the way the questions are asked, how they even ask the question, who they go to ask the question, it's institutionalized, and it's important that we address it. But yeah, I'll stop there because again, it's a thesis.
Yeah, and that really does sound much needed, and it's really exciting that piece of work it's being considered and being undertaken as well. Now, just moving on to second sort of issue. Now, today is the start of National Apprenticeship Week, and of course, apprenticeships can offer the opportunity to upskill, to retrain, to learn trades and professions, on the job. And so Asli, I'll start with Issa with this one. What role do apprenticeships have in addressing ethnic minority youth unemployment? And in your view, how effective have they been?
Good question. So, I mean, I think if you were to kind of use apprenticeships as a tool and a vehicle for upskilling, it's worth remembering where apprenticeship play out from an economic perspective. So you've got to remember that when we had the financial crash, we had a lot of people out of work and a lot of people needing new skills, but more importantly, needing skills for that critical part of recovery. And then if you look at the various backed initiatives from the government, these were all there to kind of boost skills and career mobility, especially internal mobility. Technology changed, nature of skills changed, and skills gap changed for organizations, and then needed much more rapid upskilling of existing staff, but also individuals from outside of work or who were not in work at the time. Apprentices can help that. So they essentially allow employers to train individuals to really meet a particular skill that could happen now, but also in a future period. And some employers are sort of no longer using traditional means of L&D. They're actually going through the apprenticeship route to essentially empower their organizations and bring in fresh talent and fresh knowledge and fresh insights and fresh perspectives. So why is that important for diversity? So we already know the benefits of apprenticeships. We know that they kind of you earn on the job, but you got to remember that apprenticeships can also be a vehicle for social mobility. And you may question, well, how is that possible? Well, you got to remember, if you look at traditional careers such as medicines, the laws, the ones that Black and Asian and ethnic minority communities aspire for, you've got to remember, why are these communities looking at such careers? Because, and we've badged it as the 5 pillars of social mobility, is that they provide opportunity, progression, skills, job security, and money. The final one is the most important one, because a lot of people are afraid to talk about money. But when we go into schools, we always ask young people at the age of 15 and above, what's the most important thing that you're looking for from a job? I would say about 80% of people, when one says it, about the rest of the rest of the class says, yeah, money is important to us. Because fundamentally it comes down to, we need to be able to work to live and survive. But more importantly with apprenticeships is then it gives the opportunity for individuals who can actually thrive within an organization by acquiring new skills to essentially diversify their own skill sets, but also the employers to diversify their talent pool. So what changes have we seen? Well, we know that the Black, Asian, multi-ethnic apprenticeship diversity has increased significantly. I've not had a look at the recent data, but I know it went up, but a few percent overall for the Black and Asian multi-ethnic communities. But when we look at intersections, the intersections of the Black and Asian multi-ethnic communities, especially since the introduction of the apprenticeship levy, where apprenticeships were switched over from traditional frameworks to a standard which every employer and every organization would abide by when they're delivering their qualification, what we noticed was a switch in approach. So individuals from, yes, Black and Asian multi-ethnic community apprenticeship uptake had increased. But if you look at the age categories, it was predominantly anybody and everybody over the age of 19. So what that meant was 16 to 18-year-olds had an actual decrease. Now, further delving into the data, you'll actually notice that Black communities had a decrease, but Asian communities had an increase. So when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and we look at figures and facts and figures, I'm put my hands up straight away and say, look, yes, I understand, even as an organization named BAME Apprenticeship Alliance, there are many challenges for us that when we're communicating our messages, that we talk about the intersections of race and ethnicity, that you look at the individual characteristics of communities and what their needs are, as opposed to kind of having a holistic approach to apprenticeship diversity. Are Black young people getting the right amount of support to diversify their work, to get access to apprenticeship opportunities? Are Asian communities feeling much more receptive to apprenticeship diversity because they're seeing careers like financial services taking up on it? So these are, a lot more work needs to be done, but this is just elementary data that we've had from the government a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic. Now, more importantly, obviously, the pandemic has had a significant impact, but we have seen initiatives like Kickstart, which have had a sort of positive impact. It's actually kind of recalibrated the apprenticeship landscape and the unemployment landscape to sort of where it was pre-pandemic. Does it have a positive? Does it have a negative? I think we're at the tipping edge where we now need to kind of see the benefits of such schemes that the government has brought in. Did it increase apprenticeship? Did it increase apprenticeship routes? Has youth unemployment reduced or increased, or based on where we were pre-pandemic? There is a lot of unknowns that we're waiting for the government to kind of release on that. But elementary data shows that there is some positive signs of recovery there.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, I'm going to come to you shortly on this, but I just want to say that I'm seeing a few questions come in from today's audience, and we'll get to those shortly as well. On the just a quick question for you, Issa, actually, before we go to Steve. You just mentioned Kickstart there. Do you feel like there is potentially a need for more of a focus on ethnicity within some of these government schemes, if we are seeing sort of lack of take up in certain areas?
I mean, certainly. I mean, if you look at some of the sort of the data that government released recently, particularly looking at how apprenticeship, I think it was just over 30% starts declined during the pandemic for underrepresented communities, compared with like just over 20% when it comes to apprenticeships from other communities. But more importantly, I think schemes like Kickstart really have a benefit only if the outcome at the end of it is a tangible outcome. It's not that you've gained experience. Experience is good, but it's not necessarily sustainable experience if the obligation upon the employer ends at the end of the 6-month period. Now, that all comes down to funding. That all comes down to the various education systems. From our perspective, what we have realized, what we have noticed is that if you look at, for example, this was a 2018 research, so this is obviously pre-pandemic, but in 2018, research was done by the Learning Work Institute, and they found that of around about 20% of applicants from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities for apprenticeships. About 50% of them, or just under 50% of them, didn't actually get through past the application stage. Now that's a worrying thing, that is, and that means that there are thousands of young people who at stage 1 of application process, they didn't get through. Our focus now is why that is. Well, we need to understand, do they know who they are? Do they know their skills, knowledge, skills and attributes? And really think, well, if the employers are trying to find the best talent, but the talent is there, how do we allow them to be discovered? Now, there's a phrase that I like to use, which is, you may have heard, talent is everywhere, opportunity is not. We're saying undiscovered talent is everywhere, opportunity is not. And it's the undiscovered bit that we're trying to get employers to discover by allowing young people to kind of discover themselves. Because importantly, things like Kickstart are good, but you need to be able to have that platform for them to kind of get to the next stage. And this is a challenge for government. There's a lot of opportunities there, but there's also a challenge for government there. Thank
you. No, that's really insightful to get that perspective on apprenticeships. And Steve, you've written a very insightful piece with Professor Ken Clark as well. In your perspective, what are the what role do apprenticeships have in sort of addressing the ethnic minority youth unemployment, and in your view, how effective have apprenticeships been?
Well, I mean, like, obviously they play a kind of key role in that they are just almost like the settled will of the political kind of spectrum. It's a key part of the policy mix. Whenever we hear any discussion about kind of increasing our productivity, apprenticeships are in there. And so it's like that. It is institutionally baked into what we're doing. And so governments are committed to it. And like when they show commitment to it, you do kind of see some good results and see big uptake, massive uptake since 2007, when there was the new system came in, and an actual increase, not just a nominal increase, like an increase in percentage of ethnic minority people. As Lisa's been talking about, that has tailed off a bit. So when governments turn their mind to it, it does work. What I think is a real issue is in terms of literally those young people from 16 to 24, we're still struggling to get them in. A lot of the growth is driven by 25 to 30-year-olds. So the representation of ethnic minorities as a whole in apprenticeships, like in 2018-19, was pretty much akin with the demographic within society, but it was about 10 percentage points less than the proportion of ethnic minority students in secondary schools. So we're seeing some drop off there. Some of that will be accounted for by students going to university, but it's not fully accounted for. When you look at it, break it down into ethnic groups, the proportion of apprenticeships in the 25 to 30-year age group for Black African, Black Caribbeans, but like 5 times as much as those under 19. For Asian Chinese, it's about 3 times, whereas it's less than twice for whites. So there's something there's evidential something there going on. What Isa was talking about before is really kind of interesting to me, because it kind of might produce an answer for one of the most kind of striking statistics we found during the research, which was students asked, like 15-year-old students asked, are they considering an apprenticeship? And it was 40% back in 2014 were ethnic minorities. Those people said they wanted an apprenticeship were ethnic minorities. And then you've got so much attrition to that where it goes through to apprenticeship start. So if there's like what Isa's saying about at the application stage, something's happening there. That's definitely something that can be addressed. And maybe because we've moved to a more frameworks-based kind of system, an employer-led system, that can be done. But for that to happen, you need a commitment for the employers on the kind of institutional boards of these kind of things to be representative. Now, in the recent white paper, there was definitely a commitment to have greater representation in terms of training, but not so much, there was no similar commitment for representation on kind of employer boards, which I think we need to do. If these are the kind of bottlenecks that are kind of, stifling is not the wrong word, but kind of chopping off the demand that's evidently there in the data at this point.
Yeah, that's such an important issue. I mean, representation at governance level, you know, at board level is key, as well as sort of at the training level as well. Andrea, with your sort of analysis work, again, what role do you see as apprenticeships making in terms of addressing the ethnic minority youth employment challenge?
So I think it's important to recognize that it could have quite a big impact, but everything I've been hearing, it just makes me think that perhaps young ethnic minorities are more likely to experience certain other parts of disadvantage than their peers and the white peers simply. So when those young 15-year-olds said to them, money matters, it's not because they just want to make lots of money, it's because they would be more likely to come from a family without much material means. So that would be very important to them to make sure that they can actually support themselves. And growing up in poverty, young Black children are over 50% of them grow up in poverty. For Bangladeshi and Pakistani, it's over 60 to 70%. That will have an impact on your options and how you feel what your options are. So if you're more likely to experience homelessness, if you're more likely to experience other material deprivation, this will impact your choices. And so perhaps they're interested in apprenticeships, but for other socioeconomic reasons, they are not choosing them. They, when I was at Joseph Roundtree Foundation, we found that young people especially said that there were problems with them staying in the home past the age of 18 because their parents simply just could not afford for them to be at home. So they had to leave the house. There was no room for them anymore. If you're taking on an apprenticeship, you may not be able to stay in your house long enough and in the area long enough to finish the apprenticeship. So if you're coming from some of these more disadvantaged backgrounds, intersectional disadvantaged backgrounds, that can really impact your ability to not only take an apprenticeship, but stay in it. There's also another question around culture, and not culture of the groups themselves, but culture at work. There is a lot of evidence on employer and culture at work that means that these young people are just not staying. So they're leaving because they experience discrimination, they experience racism, open racism, and there's no way for them to see around it, that they just leave. And there's another factor in education as well, in higher education, that they experience something that makes them just leave, and they're more likely to experience it, and they're more likely to not have the necessary systemic power to overcome it. So they just leave and they go find something else. So I just think there's, I told you I was going to do this. There's so many other socioeconomic factors around apprenticeships and as well as employment that perhaps it's why we need to understand a bit more what is the context around them that means that they're more likely to take certain choices. I'm also reminded of women. So women will be taking different choices as well. And part of it is because of, possibly caring responsibilities that are put on some of these young women, or other responsibilities that they may have that the men won't have. And so therefore their choices are different, and their choices in apprenticeships are different. We do know of the sectoral differences in certain ethnic minority groups take. And I think that is down to certain choices that they feel they have to make and certain opportunities they have. It is also local, what local apprenticeships are available to them. Something we have found from our young people that we talk to is, transport's a problem to even get to some of these opportunities. It's expensive, it's not available, they can't drive, they don't own a car, it's too expensive to drive a car on the wage they're on. So there's just so many other things going on that I think it may not just be the idea of the apprenticeship, it may be the access, the barriers that exist for them to even access it in the first place.
Yeah. And thank you for raising some very important issues. Amongst them was the issue of homelessness, which you also raised. And I just wanted to actually turn to a few questions that are coming in en masse from the audience. And on this issue of homelessness, we have a question from Ruth here, who asks if we could speak about how to support young adults transitioning out of homelessness with entry into work, given the unique challenges that they face? And what do you think are some of the key areas that could help these young adults move into decent work? And again, I think I'll come to Andrew with you, because some of your background with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. In terms of youth and homelessness, what are some of the, how would you address that sort of question?
I must admit, housing is not my forte, but if you think about what homelessness means for a young person, it means no fixed address, which is a significant barrier. They don't, if you do an application for a job, you have to have an address, and if you are homeless, you simply don't have one. So having access to temporary housing, not just temporary housing, but like long-term housing where they can actually stay and apply for jobs, put roots down. They need to be able to put roots down in order to get an apprenticeship, education, job, etc. And I think it's at that barrier themselves of not being able to get into a home. I am not as versed in what the actual support is given to young people who are actually homeless, but I would suspect that would mean that certain organizations and certain groups, if you're an employer, if you are a employer looking at apprenticeships, actually going out yourself and trying to engage with organizations that support young people who are homeless and getting access to that apprenticeship and getting access to that job or that education would be vital, because otherwise you're missing out. It's not like they don't have skills. It's that at the moment they just don't have a fixed address and they don't have anywhere to stay, but they still have potential and they still have the opportunity to do great things. They just need somewhere to stay and they need somewhere to start. I think that's what I could really say for now, but I'd be interested in anyone else's opinion.
Thank you. And Steve or Ita, is there any how would you kind of see this issue of youth homelessness and the sort of specific challenges that young people have with kind of accessing sort of decent work? So would you want to come into this one?
It's an interesting one. I mean, of course, from our sector and what we face, what we look after is largely with regards to those who have an address. So if I'm honest, I'm probably not well experienced in this space. What I would say is there are a number of organizations like that work in this space that would know that. So the first one that comes to mind is an organization called BAME, and they sort of work with homeless people to kind of give them the skills to find them jobs. So there are it's called BAME, and they do all the work with regards to homeless communities. But the challenge will still remain the same. It's in terms of kind of convincing them to go into a particular route of employment, whether it be an apprenticeship or others. Like I said, the opportunities are there. That we've got vacancies that come through from Bentley, from Coca-Cola, from XYZ. They don't care where you come from or what you're doing. They just want to be able to help you. They want the best talent. So if you're living in a tree and you've got the best talent, then they want somebody like yourself, but they understand a lot more employers, particularly ones we work with, are more understanding of some of the socioeconomic issues individuals face. Always, if there's an institution that represents a young person that's homeless, always connect them, always speak to the employer directly and say, look, this is my situation, what can I do? Employers are there willing to help. If they can find the right talent, then they will be able to do what they can. It's a bit of a bizarre quote. It's a bit of a bizarre analogy that I heard it's gonna make you laugh when I heard this, but compatibility between for example, if through a dating app, and a guy and a girl meet in whoever they may be, they meet and they live across the Atlantic, they will find a way to be able to work out the issues with regards to living with each other, with that to and all them issues. But they've got to be able, one of them's got to make the effort to kind of ask the questions, ask the other person, look, this is my situation, how can I make it work? Until you ask these questions to employers, you won't actually find a resolution. There's no one answer for one person. each individual will have their own circumstances, and employers can be flexible in terms of how they support. Some employers have, I'll give you an example, some employers have paid for, this is rare, but some employers have paid for rent for individuals, and then they get that, claim that money back through a salary, a cut in their salary where they claim that money back through. So employers can be flexible. If they find the right talent, employers can be flexible.
Thank you. And actually, Steve, I just want to actually, just before I move on just a little bit, just to, there's another question that's coming from the audience, just around, to what extent do you think that tackling occupational segregation could also have a positive impact on employment rates of ethnic and racial minorities? So what kind of sectoral sort of, if we've discussed a little bit around the sectors of young of ethnic minorities and young workers, do you feel that tackling some occupational segregation could have a positive impact in this regard?
Well, I definitely think it's an opportunity that needs to be taken up, because if you see the sectors that are most attractive to ethnic minority apprentices, they tend to mirror what we're seeing in applications for higher education as well. So there's a certain route for that, it's like traditional routes on average seen for ethnic minority students. So what that suggests to a certain extent is that apprenticeships aren't breaking a mold in as a way possibly as they can. They're not introducing young people to potential different routes where they may well succeed. I was looking at some data in terms of attainments for broken down by sector, most recent ones, and in most sectors the attainment rate is higher for whites than it is for ethnic minority ones, apart from a few, including leisure, travel and tourism, and it was more arts-based ones, but the arts-based ones are kind of areas that are really kind of getting low engagement with ethnic minority apprentices. But there's some small evidence there. The evidence has to be taken with a grain of salt because we're dealing with small numbers. That if we can encourage engagement with these areas, there's a chance for areas where people like from ethnic minority background haven't had as much of an opportunity. There is a way to break it out. So there's definitely a route to do it, but it's again about reaching those people, reaching those students, and encouraging them to not take a risk, but like make it less of a risk to take that route. And that's what I think one of the things that apprenticeships should be able to offer. Yeah, definitely.
Now, just kind of wrapping up a little bit. Now, we are, of course, dealing with the pandemic, and if we look at the after effects of the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis, I mean, that the effects of that crisis lasted much longer for young people from ethnic minorities in terms of the economic recovery in that respect. And what can we do to ensure that young people from ethnic minority groups economically recover from the crisis of the pandemic? And I know, Issa, I know that you may have to leave a bit earlier, so I might just pose that question to you first.
I'd say money is invest in local communities. So during the pandemic, we launched a report on how employers can work with so Black, Asian, North ethnic communities, and essentially what we came down to the conclusion was there needs to be an investment in local communities, organizations that work with underrepresented communities, particularly building their capacity to support employment and skills. And and I've got to be critically clear here, there have been a number of schemes over the past few years, past decades, where governments and institutions are pumping money into organizations, and it's a bums on seat approach. It can't be a bums on seat approach. What I mean by bums on seat approach is if they're running a program and that program they've got to get 1,000 people in to get that funding, then essentially, whilst that has its own merit or that has its own reasons for it, if the the outcomes not being met, and the destinations for these individuals not being met, particularly sustainable employment. We're not talking about, well, we just get them in the job and that's it, we're done dusted. We're on about sustainable employment, where they are in that employment in that employment position for a long time, or at least a year. Then until we solve that part, we're not actually solving. But what we're doing is just going on a running machine where we're tackling. We're not. There's not much movement. People are going into jobs, but they're not progressing through their own careers. The other thing I'd say when it comes to employers is use your own existing data to better understand where you are as an organization. This, even if you've got 0.0001% of representation within the organization, at least you state that. At least you make it clear that this is where we are. Until you know your starting point, you won't know where your end destination is. And there's no point talking about the end destination until you establish that starting point. Share that information as widely as possible within the organization. It's not necessarily a way of sort of shame or anything like that. It's actually self accountability to say, look, this is what we've got. This is where we want to be, and we need your support, and we're here to back any initiative that you may have in the workplace. Within the data is ensure that it's intersectional. You don't say, well, we're represented from BAME communities, but if you look at the data, you're not. If you look at saying, well, we're represented, but actually 96% of your staff members are, 96% of your represented colleagues are from Asian communities, and then the 4% are from Black communities, or 1% from other minorities, then in fact you're not. There's an imbalance there. So the data is well established. It's got to be broken down into ethnicity. It's got to be broken down into those progression within the organization. Is your talent pool early on, early career, in the early careers part of the organization, are they concentrating ethnic minorities? And then as it goes further up the career pathway, it dwindles down to single figures and individual figures. Then so there's a lot of analysis that comes down to data that plays a massive role.
Definitely. And as you say, that sort of intersectionality, looking at the nuance, is critically important. And yeah, so I would like to pose the same question to you, Andrea, as we move into recovery from the pandemic. What can we do to ensure that young people from ethnic minorities groups economically recover from the crisis of the pandemic?
Thanks. So I think first it's important to note that this is an entirely different labor market than before the pandemic. So, in 1 year, over 400,000 jobs were lost in the pandemic that were usually done by young people. There's been a significant contraction of the youth labor market, with more staying or moving into full-time education and not going into work. But there's also, substantial opportunity, especially if you are thinking about providing that stepping stone. So, it goes back to as well that polarization. After the last recession, we saw a significant increase in insecure work, largely by Black workers. There was, I think it was 4 times the amount of Black workers found themselves in insecure work than white workers. And that was some work that Joseph Retry Foundation did with the University of Manchester around 2015, 2016. And that actually exacerbated this idea that sectoral polarization overall, where some ethnic minority groups of all ages were more likely to be in these low paid, more insecure jobs, hospitality, leisure, care, etc., where there were very few opportunities for them to progress, and they were just kind of stuck there and stood there. Whereas some of the other ethnic minority groups were more likely to be in organizations or sectors that allowed them progression. And progression is not from low skill to high skill; it's the mid-skill opportunities is what we really need to discuss. And so I would just say that this does create an opportunity, because especially when you think about net zero, going to a net zero transition, it offers an opportunity for these mid-skill jobs that young people can get involved in construction and healthcare and housing, that roles and sectors that they are more likely to be going in right now anyway, but they can actually go in more secure work. Because when we ask young people what they want, they said that they want a good job with good pay, progression opportunities that allow them to actually move up the ladder and do things that you would normally want. You know, it's almost like you want a normal life. So
Yeah.
I think that's why it presents an opportunity, but it is making sure that we create these opportunities that is not just low versus high skill polarization of the labor market, which we sort of have right now, but these mid-level opportunities where they can go and start working in hospitality, but then get that stepping stone to a higher paid job. So
yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and also Steve, I've got to ask you the same question.
Mm-hmm.
How do we recover from sort of like the pandemic, particularly with the ethnic minority, young ethnic minority, with younger ethnic minorities. Sorry, I'm trying to get my words out.
Well, I think the kind of like taking on this kind of wider structural view of things, it's about really needing to kind of foreground these issues. I mean, like a lot of this research that I did a year ago, we were talking about the fact that there have been countless reports into inequality, racial inequality, ethnic inequality, up to like 78 separate recommendations. And then, but like the implementation of these recommendations have been patchy at best. And you still see it. I mean, like there's a clear commitment for some kind of economic change, but it's the idea of, if it's a broad brush, as we discussed, there is already kind of a gap, an ethnic gap in inequality. If you're just rising the level for everyone, the gap's still going to be there. So you need to specifically recognize and address this gap and kind of be specific. Look at these recommendations that kind of experts have looked at, start to look at them. I mean, I discussed the white paper in the DFE. Some mention, some recognition, definitely, of ethnic inequality, but then folded into everything else we're going to do. Look at the levelling up paper, again, last week. Some definite recognition that there is there, but no, then folded up into the general policy. Even today, there's an announcement on encouraging apprenticeships within kind of the transport network, and like the new leaders for transport there. And within the press release, a recognition of the need to encourage more ethnic diversity within it, but then folded up into everything else. So we need to we need to recognize if this is an outcome that we want. And I think in general, for the most part, some skepticism can be allowed, but like I think in general, people do recognize this as an outcome that we want. Then we need to actually do it. And as I said, we need money for it. We need to spend the money to do it.
Definitely. Thank you. And that's really, really insightful. And okay, we're just about to end now, but if I could just ask you maybe just to maybe one or two seconds quite quickly in the last 2 minutes. We have a great question here that's coming from Julian, and he asks, how do we move towards the ideas and change that needs to happen? What solutions are out there, that work? So how do we move from ideas and change towards the ideas? How do we move towards the ideas and change that needs to happen in a few sentences? I know it's a broad question, and what solutions are out there that work?
Well, I'd say take lessons from what works. At the moment, like there was an interesting little bit of evidence in a recent resolution foundation based on, sorry, it wasn't resolution, it's a National Audit Office based on Kickstart. Kickstart was directly directed at young people on universal credit. Now, the take-up of Kickstart jobs, percentage of ethnic minorities on Kickstart was higher than the representation on universal credit. Now, there's a lot of caveats involved with that. That could be a lack of incentive from the white majority or not. But if not, why?
Yeah.
What happened there? What happened to reach kids on universal credit to encourage them to get it? Was it a pandemic effect? Was it because it was a flashy new thing? Or was it something in the design? And then fold that back into the bigger institutions we have. Don't continually design a new kind of scheme. Use the schemes we have and build and learn on stuff we have. I don't think it's the flashy new thing we need to do. It's kind of like constantly learning and feeding it back in.
And Andrea, as we move into our sort of final sort of 60 seconds, could I ask you the same question?
I also think it would be important to be willing to learn from international examples. There's a lot of evidence, especially out of places like Germany. There's even evidence out of the US where they have substantially higher population of Black or ethnic minority groups, but that also means they have better data and they have really good studies on what really works to help put young people in employment and in good employment and all over the country. So you can use some of these examples and see how we can implement them here in the UK. It's also important to note that I think that the government is interested in this question. They're also really interested in understanding this. It's part of the egg. They're very interested in understanding this, and I think they're also receptive to really good ideas. So it is engagement with them and engagement with policymakers and those who can do the work to implement them.
Well, thank you all for such a fascinating discussion, and thank you to the audience for all your questions as well. I'm sorry, I do apologize in advance that we didn't have the time to go through every question there, but yeah, there was really some really fantastic interaction going on. Please get in touch with us at the Runnymede Trust, and we can also forward any questions, and let's continue the conversation on this important issue. But I'll end the webinar and discussion here. And just to say thanks to everybody for attending, and a very special thanks to all our panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well.
All right. Bye.
Bye.